So I'm going to present this work on household sharing and commitment, and then this long subtitle, Evidence from Panel Data on Individual Expenditures and Time Use. And it's joint work with Ken Yamada, who's sitting here as well. Okay. I guess this is not on. Okay. Okay, so to sort of start up where I'm going here, there's now substantial evidence when we look across households in the cross section that one thing, power seems very uneven across men and women, and it seems to vary across households. And there seems to be strong evidence that its relative bargaining position of men and women are related to things like their relative market productivity, marriage market opportunities, etc. And we have, the collective model of the household gives us a sensible way to rationalize this, nice way to identify things and interpret things. Almost all of the evidence we have on that comes from cross-sectional data. Okay, and so it's differences across households in relative market productivity. You see differences in bargaining positions of the individuals across those households. Okay, oftentimes when we take those estimates and we interpret them, we think that we can think of those as households and think of changing the wages within those households over time, and you would expect it to get sort of the same reaction as we get in the cross section. It's not obvious that that's true or that's going to be the case, and that's sort of one of the things we want to talk about today. So in addition to the straight sort of cross-sectional evidence, there's some especially more recent evidence looking at actually changes within a household. So I don't have the citation here, but I'm thinking of Attanasio and Lashin's recent paper where they're using a randomized controlled experiment where it's a kind of intervention where essentially the women get access to much more resources, and it's a substantial amount. It's something like half of the household's consumption, and we see in households that have access to those resources, the bargaining positions shift in favor of the woman. Okay, but what we don't have in that study is the ability to simultaneously look at the differences across households and differences within households. Okay, so this one we get the within, and so we still don't know whether that those estimates kind of line up together. So what we really want to know is get some evidence on the relative importance in terms of the information known at time of marriage, which we can think of as generating the heterogeneity across households, and innovations that happen during marriage, okay, which we can think of as, for a given household, when things change, opportunities change, how do the bargaining positions change? Okay. Now the paper that we're going to lean on for a lot of nice insights is this well-known paper by Mazzocco from 2007. And he develops a very nice theory and a very nice test for testing a full commitment or ex-ante efficiency against a limited commitment type of household. Now he does the test and rejects full commitment, but the setup is one where you can't really get estimates in the sense that you can test for the lack of full commitment and in favor of limited commitment, but you're not going to get estimates of the thing that we're looking for, sort of this relative importance in the cross-section versus the dynamics within the household. And largely that's coming from because he doesn't really have any direct information. So the data that he's using here, which works for the test, is a time series of cross-sections, construct a pseudo-panel, and then use the aggregate implications. Okay, and that works for the test, but doesn't give you estimates. So where we're going to go beyond what we know from Mazzocco is we're going to provide some, as I say here, evidence of the dynamics of intra-household allocation. The hero of the paper is going to be this unique data that we have access to. So we're going to use this panel data So we have the same households over time. And within that data, we have observations on individual private consumption. So consumption assigned to the husband, the wife, the children, and for household type of things, as well as time use within there. So the market hours of the husband and the wife, the home hours of the husband and wife, and the leisure time of the husband and wife. So in some sense, we observe the entire allocation of time and goods within the household, and we observe that over time. Okay? So we're going to get really direct information here. Okay. So just to preview what we're going to find before I go in and tell you, about how we're going to do that and give you quite a bit of detail about the data. We're going to find, what we expect, consistent with the large literature on what we see from a cross section, that relative allocations are strongly related to relative market productivity between households. So information known at the time of marriage is strongly predicted of the relative bargaining power of individuals in the household. And within households, innovations, and that's kind of an important word there, innovations to relative productivity affect allocations as well. Okay, and we're going to, consistent with Mizuko, we're going to find evidence. Well, we're going to reject ex-ante efficiency or full commitment in favor of a limited commitment setup, and we'll be able to say something about the extent to which, given your initial position at the start of marriage, how much you might expect things to move over time during the marriage. Okay. So there's some literature that we're obviously going to build on, and I'm going to skip over that. I'll talk directly about the model and then go into the data. Okay. So the model is going to be well-known, straightforward, standard kind of model, and so all of the model is going to be just on this page, and then I'll talk about some details about it afterwards. But this is telling us all of the structure about how we're going to interpret the data, right? So we have in mind a household which has two members who are decision makers. We'll call them A and B, and generally going to call A the wife and B the husband. They're if time 0 is a time of marriage, they're thinking about maximizing the expected present discounted weighted sum of those utilities, where utilities of the individuals are coming from preferences over own private consumption, own leisure time, and consumption of a home-produced public good. I have these X's in here just to kind of remind ourselves that it may be useful, especially for identification, if we have some observable shifters that may shift within period preferences or between period preferences, but you can ignore that essentially. And so they're going to be choosing these sequences of consumption, market hours, leisure, home hours, and market purchased goods that are going to go into that production of that home good. And I've written this in the sequence form, but so of course you want to think of these as state contingent plans, so you could write this recursively as well. Okay. So the weights, or which we generally think of as related to the bargaining power, we're going to have a mu and a 1 minus mu. I'll discuss a little bit, actually in quite a bit of detail in the next two slides, why there may or may not be a T subscript on there and what might be moving that around. Right. So as I mentioned, we're going to have home production. It's going to be produced with market purchased goods, as well as the hours of person A and person B. There's going to be a time constraint so that leisure, home hours, and market hours sum up to the total time available for each individual. We have each period, we have a budget constraint here written in the full income budget constraint. So all of the things we're consuming, private consumption, goods going into home production, leisure hours and home hours going into production for both of the individuals has to come out of total potential income, which is the full income you could get if everyone worked full time, and then plus whatever resources the household is moving across periods, right? And so that right-hand side, most of the time we'll just refer to it as the full income devoted to period T.
What's the implication of assuming away differences in discount rates and discounting functions across husbands and wives. Somehow that's magically been agreed upon, I guess, in the specification, whereas mu is something that we...
Right. So I haven't told you very much about UA and UB. So in principle, it could all be handled in there, but I'm not going to do that. So we're going to have it just this common discount factor. Okay. So the implication for that is it would play out in terms of possible disagreements in how they're going to allocate assets over time, et cetera. Okay. So we're going to put that in the background, partly because we're not going to rely very much on those really dynamic equations. Almost everything we need to get can be everything we need. The conditions that we need to learn about the Pareto weight, and including how it changes over time, can all be done off of within period relative allocations. Okay? And you get the dynamic part by how those within period relative allocations change over time. Okay? So we don't have to fully specify the whole process for savings in order to get most of what we want. Okay? If we wanted to then do much more, if we want to do a lot of policy experiment and things like that, then that's going to play a lot. But this isn't even going to be a parameter that we estimate. Okay. I think I've got most of that on there, right? We're going to have to, there's going to have to be some expectation about the stochastic process for wages, and we have to make some statement about this mu guy here. Okay. So in terms of talking a bit about that T subscript on the mu, where it might come from. Again, as I mentioned before, we're gonna lean heavily on Mazzocco here. We made this nice distinction between the set of things we might want to think of as distribution factors, or all of the variables that may affect the Pareto weight, and splitting them into sort of two groups. Ones we're going to index with a Z0, and ones with a Z1 with a T that may be time varying. Okay, so in the Z0 are going to be all of the things that are either known or expectations about things at time 0. Okay, so the known quantities and the forecast of quantities at time 0. And then what's going to have the T subscript is innovations or deviations from those initial expectations. Okay, so if we are thinking about, and this will be kind of the main thing that's going in the estimation, if we think the important thing here is the relative potential wages of the husband and the wife, we'd have in here in Z0 would be what it was at the time of marriage, plus some expectation about where it might be going over the marriage, and in here would be deviations from that expectation. Okay. Now that's a useful way to split up those variables, because then we can relate statements about commitment, the extent to which households can commit to plans that they made at the start of marriage, or statements about ex-ante efficiency, to what is affecting the Pareto weight. So the statement that the household is able to fully commit or make ex-ante efficient allocations is equivalent to saying that Pareto weight actually doesn't have this T subscript. It only depends on that information that's available at time 0. Okay? And so if they're fully able to commit, that's just going to stay constant. The household's going to behave like a unitary household, and everything is going to be fine. There's going to be heterogeneity across households, so it's still going to have the feature of the sort of cross-sectional collective things that the weight does depend on those relative allocations at time 0, but they're not going to change over time. Lack of commitment, limited commitment or no commitment, it's going to result in allocations that are still within period efficient, but the household's not going to be able to attain the ex-ante efficiency. It's not going to be able to attain the amount of insurance that it might be able to do if it could keep mu fixed ex-ante. That's going to show up here in terms of the mu being a function both of those the information known at the beginning of marriage, and also the innovations during the marriage there. Okay? And so that's largely what we're going to be looking for in the data. Now, a well-known special case of this where the period T information appears is where it appears in a particular way, which is the limited commitment model, where that weight only moves when one of the participation constraints is binding within the household, right? So that would look like this, and you would have that the weight is just staying constant anytime the participation constraint is satisfied for both members of the household. So the value of being married is always greater than the value of becoming single for both. There's that weight's going to stay constant, and it's only going to move when that's violated for one of those people. It's going to move based on the information available in that period, and then stay constant again. The statistical implication of that is that this process is going to be memoryless or look like a random walk. We'll have a look at that implication once we have the estimates. Okay. All right. So the data. So the data is coming from Japan. The data set's called the Japanese Panel Survey of Consumers, and we have this fairly long period. So we have some households that are in there for 15 years, from 93 to 2007. The sample is constructed from these three cohorts. There was an initial cohort of 1,500 women aged between 20 and 34 who were interviewed in 1993 and then continuously interviewed forward. A second cohort brought in 97, and a third cohort brought in 2003. Okay, so we're going to have these relatively young women that are sort of the sample, and then their partners and family, et cetera, as they develop, and we follow them forward for those maximum 15 years in this particular data set. Now we have the information we have in the data set that we're going to use is basically observing all of the allocations. So we have what the information about the allocation of time. So they're going to answer for the husband and the wife how many hours they're spending, going to school, work, on homework, housekeeping and childcare, hobby, leisure, social interaction, and for other activities like sleeping, eating, and personal care. And so we're gonna treat 1, 2, and 3 as market hours. This school stuff is irrelevant for anyone in this sample. Housekeeping is going to be, housekeeping and childcare is going to be the home production time, and the things that are specifically called leisure and hobby, plus things like sleeping, are going to be considered leisure here.
Categories, or have you grouped them?
These are the categories, and then I'm going to group them this way to get our.
What's going on within each category?
We don't know what's going on within each category. So in this case, I don't know whether they're sleeping or eating, but I know at the margin they prefer that. I'm going to assume they prefer that to supplying hours in the market.
And the wife had response for both.
The wife is responding for both. So through this, that's, you may or may not think that's very, very important. Throughout the whole thing, the wife is going to be responding for the members of the household.
How do you deal with the fact that you joined Lise for your kid?
So the activities with the kid are going to go into producing Q, which you like. Okay, so there's this indirect. If you like spending time with your kid, you're gonna want Q to be high. That's the way it's going to go in there, right? And all of the things that you spend, like you're spending money on. Right. So I think I wasn't clear about that, but Q, you want to. Q, this public good in the household is going to include children. Right. That's going to be one of the most important public goods in the household. Okay. So I guess to be very specific, you like spending time with your kid because it produces a high Q.
Right,
the way
because
to
I'm
interpret
really
it.
more worried about the data issue. If I take my kid to a baseball game, they're gonna be 4 or 5.
I won't be able to tell here.
Right, you won't be able to tell here, the question is, how would they answer?
I mean,
You know,
I can't not possibly speculate on that, right? The best I can do is not impose a lot of separability, so it's going to kind of all go in there. Okay. All right. So in addition to the time information, there's a consumption expenditure module. So part of the consumption expenditure module is kind of the standard questions you would get in a consumption expenditure survey, in the sense of what items did you spend your budget on. Okay. I'm not going to go through all of those, but that's kind of data that we understand pretty well. It's going to look like the CEX or the FAMX and things like that we're used to seeing. The information that's more interesting, that's kind of unique in this data, is that after they go through that discussion about all of the things you spent your money on, they say of the total budget, how much of that was for things that were for everyone in the family, how much were just for you, just your husband, just for the children, and someone else. Okay, and so these are the things that we're going to think of as the public expenditures for everyone in the household and directly on children, and private expenditures, just on me, just for the husband. Okay. Now, okay. Oops. So a little bit of summary statistics. So we have some idea about what these guys look like. I won't spend tons of time on this. In terms of those, what we're calling the public and the private consumption expenditures, the public ones are the most important for these households. On average, they're spending 80%, and they're calling that public goods. Right? This is all the housing, everything that does with children, and the things that they're really calling private as the remaining 20%. And it's pretty on average pretty unevenly divided between the husband and the wife here. Right? 15% versus 5%.
So who is responding to this question? Is it the husband?
It's always the wife.
It's always the wife?
Yeah.
Okay, so the husband might respond differently?
He might respond differently, and I have absolutely no way to know whether he would respond differently or not. I'll show you in a minute on the next slide, if I can get to that slide, some correlations that make us not too suspicious of these things.
Yeah, in particular, when she answers, it's for the whole family.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, I would bet that food is there. Although we think of food as being private, but of course, so it's not completely clear that this all for whole family is exclusively public good. It might be some goods that we traditionally think of as private.
Yeah, I guess I would be broader than I would think of having a meal with the family as being a public thing. It's better if they're all there. Everyone is enjoying the conversation, and that's the whole. But I understand exactly what you're
Anyway,
saying.
this is testable, right? Because in principle, if you know, just know the simple fact that you have one assignable good,
Mm-hmm.
which partner allows you to, in principle, to recover the level of private consumption or things like this. Given that the last two items are obviously the things that you buy for the kids, for instance, those are certainly public.
Yeah.
So in principle, you could endogenously decide what's public and what's private within this category one. But it's just the 81% that looks very large.
That looks, okay. So it looks large. It doesn't feel that large. Maybe it's because I live in London and we spend almost 80% on housing, but it doesn't look that large to me. What was I going to say? So these are obviously not the same number, so there's differences there. And part of what we want to know is how much of this is preferences and how much of this is unequal sharing, right? It's fine. It's going to be, it could be that the weights are 1/2, 1/2, and you'd still get this just because this guy eats lots or things like that, right?
How much of this 15% is work-related expenses, which are, in Japan, there's a, female labor force participation is low, and that might.
I'll show you what I think it is. Okay, I think it's drinks after work.
Okay, then it's different.
Where were we going to go? There's differences in market hours. On average, the men are working in the market twice as much as the women. At home, they're not just doing, on average, they're not doing very much at all relative to the women. But in terms of leisure, they're not so unequal, right? There's a few hours difference there, but they're not being crazy. Okay. So this is just a reduced form regression, but it's to try to figure out a little bit, I think, of where you're going about the mapping between what those categories were and what these guys are reporting as private just for the wife, for the husband, and public kind of things. So there's two panels here. The top one is pooling everything, so this is the cross-section. You should think of this as comparing across households. The bottom one has fixed effects in it, so it's really within household changes. Okay. And so this is the easiest one to think about. If we go across here, this is basically asks the following. So when the household says that they've between period T and T plus 1, that they've increased spending for the whole family, they're also saying that they've increased spending on food, they've increased spending on housing, they've increased spending on utilities. When they make statements about increasing spending on the wife, they also say that they've increased clothing spending and health expenditures. And when they say they're increasing spending on the husband, they also report that they've increased pocket money spending. That's why I think it's the beer after work. And the obvious kind of ones, we increased spending on children. They've increased educational, so they've increased educational spending. So it seems like they're lining up with the kind of categories we sort of expect. There are a bunch of omitted ones in here where there's not much going on. I sort of highlighted in red the both largest in terms of economic, and those are all statistically significant. And it's the same things when you look across households as when you look within households. Okay, so just a few more just pictures of the data. If we draw these things in terms of shares, so A is always going to be the wife here and B the husband. In terms of their wage, so this is their potential wage share of the wife. We have it's fairly distributed. It's never above 1 here. So these wives are never earning more than their husband. And almost all of it is, below half. Most of it's around here, 0.3. So these guys are pretty much, their wages are half of their husband on average.
So that is the earnings.
This is the wage.
Wage rate.
Wage rate.
Conditional work. Well,
We observe at least one wage for almost all of these guys because of the panel. And so this is either averaged across what we see, or it's the one that we see, right? Okay. Because we got these women young, most of them are working before they come on. Okay, so then the same type of picture for what we see in terms of the consumption share, the private consumption share of the wife. Again, there's a distribution there. It goes basically from 0 to 1.
Do you compare education as well?
These conditional in education?
No, before when we were talking about the wage.
Yeah, so there are a couple years difference in education on average. Okay. Sorry, I pointed to the wrong thing. You're right. Pierre-Andre is.
Except that the variance is slightly larger.
The variance is slightly larger for the men.
I don't understand. It says 13.2 and 13.4.
Yeah, almost the same.
Yeah, not a couple of years ago.
No, I was.
Oh, okay.
I was looking at age, and clearly 37 and 34 are not right.
Just click again on the next slide, the graph. When the when...
Which one, this one?
Well, either one, because in the end, it's just what's on the matrix there. Past 1/2 is when the wife potential weight is more than the husband, right? And so everything below...
Correct. I completely misspoke on that.
Assumption, it's going to be the same, I guess.
It's going to be the same, yeah. Thank you for pointing that out.
These are pre-tax or post-tax? Because there seems to be big incentive, actually disincentive for women to work in Japan, right, in the fiscal system. Above a certain ratio, if you're the second earners, you're punished very much.
So I don't remember off the top of my head the answer to your question. We worried about this and then stopped worrying about it, so I want to say it's after tax. Okay, and now I have 15 minutes and I'm still showing pictures. Okay, so I'll go quickly through this, but there's a positive relationship between those shares. This is a median regression line in terms of the shares of consumption and wages. So it's not, they're not completely unrelated. The leisure, relative leisure, much less dispersion in that. Not too much relationship between relative wages and relative leisure.
Jeremy, given that the leisure time seems to be so similar, you don't think it's just time just spent together?
Some of it could be time spent together, yes.
Then there could be like some complementarity?
Well, a chunk of it's going to be time spent together because sleep is in there, and conditional on sharing a room, they're going to be together. Whether there's a lot of strong complementarity, okay, I won't go there. Given I have 15 minutes, let me not think through all of the implications of that right now. Okay. Again, a big chunk is being spent on the public good. No one is really spending less than half on that. It's mildly declining, but pretty much flat in the wage share. Market hours, increasing in the wage share as you would hope, and home hours, again concentrated very high towards one, and to some extent decreasing in the wife's wage share. So as that goes up, she's spending a lower share in the market. Okay. So, I mean, we want to go after estimating the Pareto weight. What we want to be able to do is condition on preference, et cetera, because we don't want, we want to allow preference heterogeneity across men and women and across with lots of observables, et cetera. So we're going to, have to specify all of these things. We do also have a big robustness case where we're much more agnostic on all of these, but I won't go through that now. So we're going to have, utilities of these guys are going to be these, the CES type of utilities. We're going to have, these shifters can change with observables, and all the preferences are free to be different across men and women. Home production is going to be this CES in hours, and Cobb-Douglas with market purchased goods. The wage we're going to model as having, an individual fixed effect. Okay, so that's going to be important in the initial conditions. There's going to be an experience profile, or to be clear, a potential experience profile, and then a shock term, which we're going to model as a random walk. Okay. Now, so that the innovations in the wage are going to be the main things that are going to be going into the the potential things that can change the Pareto weight. And so really what's going to be going in there. So at the time of marriage information we're going to be using is basically the difference in wages, or difference in log wages, or the relative wage of the wife versus the husband at time of marriage, and the difference in the average profile over 10 years. Okay, so some information about whether they expect people to be flat or increasing. And then going into the Z, it's really going to be differences in the accumulated shocks. Right? That's what's That's what's going to be going in there, differences in accumulated shocks. And then so what's going to be identifying the changes in the Pareto weight is going to be coming off of the first order conditions within period first order conditions, the ratio of marginal utility of consumption, person A to person B, is going to relate to the relative weights. And then over time, that's going to be true in every period. So if we look across 2 periods, the change in that has to satisfy this equation equal to 0. We have a similar equation for the ratio of marginal utilities of leisure. Of course, that's also going to involve the relative wage in the current period. And so the way the mu's are going to be identified is conditional on everything we've thrown into control for possible changes in the marginal utility of consumption. What's remaining and is explainable by our distribution factors is going to help us understand about what's going on with Z here. All right. So 10 minutes. So these are, okay, I'm going to skip this and go straight to, okay, this is a statement about 10 minutes, okay. So there's a statement about our estimates. So in terms of home production, we're going to get that. We find that the time of the husband and wife has some mild complementarity. It's not perfectly substitutable. The efficiency of time in the household is pretty similar. It's pretty symmetric. So those large differences are coming off of relative market productivities, not home productivities. The wives in these households put a higher weight on the public goods than their husband, and they put an increasingly higher weight the more children that are in there. Okay, so they are going to have disagreements within the household about how much resources to devote to the public good, especially if there are lots of children. And we estimate complementarity across these goods. Let me skip that. I'm going to skip that picture. These are the estimates for the Pareto weight. Let me look at column 1 here. So at the mean of the sample of the data, we find the Pareto weight to be 0.41, so a little bit more favorable to the husband than the wife. Is strongly related in the cross section to differences.
So the monotonic transformations are different, right?
Say that again.
The monotonic transformations
of what?
Of the 2 utilities. The curvature of the 2 utilities are different.
Correct.
I'm just asking. So 50-50 doesn't necessarily mean 50-50 consumption.
No, definitely not. Definitely not. They're strongly related to the differences in the relative wage at time of marriage, also to the differences in the growth. So expectations about growth are going to matter there. Total resources don't seem to play very much of a role, and then the innovation, so this is the information revealed over time, is coming in, strongly predictive. So differences in, realized wages over the time of marriage are also going to be very predictive. So these are the within household changes in the weight, strongly related to differences in realized wages during the course of marriage. Okay. Now we wanted to check 2 sort of things. One about whether what we're measuring as shocks to the household are really shocks to the household as opposed to things they already know. So that's what I've put here in column 4. So in column 4, what we've included is the shock, what we're calling the relative innovation, but 1 period ahead. When you put that in there, it has no explanatory power. Okay, so at least it doesn't look like these guys have advanced information about these shocks. So we're relatively confident the way we've constructed them is reasonable. The other thing we wanted to check is whether the Pareto weight that we end up estimating looks like it has a memoryless process. So after we conditioned on last period's information, everything known up to last period and the new information this period, earlier period information has no effect. Okay, so it's really looks memoryless. It doesn't look like these guys are forecasting these innovations going forward. Okay. So the last thing, go ahead.
I was just wondering what you do about divorce, because I would guess that if shocks are large enough, that might trigger divorce, and so maybe you're kind of artificially dropping.
So for the main results, we use intact households, and then as a robustness check, we use everyone and look at whether the results change, and they don't. Okay, that's the most we do. Okay. Okay, so this will be the last picture I want to show, I think. So this is if we take the the ratio of the weights, then given the forms we've chosen, it has this multiplicative form, so that you have the the weight, the information at time 0 multiplied by changes, new information over time. Okay, so then we can break that into those two pieces. So this is the distribution of what I'm calling mu0 of z there. And again, this is relative. So 1 would be half. So this is the distribution in the cross section. It's a pretty wide range between 0.5 and 2, concentrated here around 0.6. But this is where the household starts, given the information known at the time of marriage. There's lots of variation there. The panel on the right is how the household may move around given new information here. Okay. This is substantially less dispersed, and I did put some numbers here. So, over the sample that we have, which is 15 years, there's only 10% of households. Sorry, let me rephrase that. More than half the households don't experience a revision more than 10%. Okay, so most of the households are around here. There's a lot of mass right around 1, so there's not much going on. So those households, it's not like their weights are changing all over the place.
So you rely on the revision of the wage, right?
Correct.
So and many women often don't work.
Right. So in that case, it's going to be staying flatter.
So you don't have some kind of underlying process.
We have an underlying process for the mean. So if they were working, we have a potential experience in there. We were expecting it to be drifting up, but all of that expected growth is all going to be already in here. Okay, so the innovations are going to be in terms of deviations from what was expected.
So if, for example, she's getting let's call them human capital shocks, that are not at that point changing her decision, say because they are recontracting the household.
Then we're not going to observe those, and the information we're going to observe is his shocks. It's always in terms of the relative.
So doesn't that in some sense force you to say that the Pareto weights are not changing much?
I'm not saying they're not changing at all, but I think you're right that that's going to give a tendency for them to change less, because for those women who are never working, it's going to their contribution to that is not moving around. Now, it's not true that the participation rate of women here is quite high. Okay? They work many fewer hours, but it's not correct that they're all at home and the men are all in work. Okay, so that
Then you could credibly construct a process that's ongoing. I mean, you can identify it, right? You can identify you have identified indeed the stochastic process of wages for women.
Correct.
And you could keep it going even when she's not working.
That's also correct. We could do that. The way we would arrive at these estimates is going to be different, but in principle, that's true. That's true. I think that I don't want to state the exact participation rate because I'm going to get it wrong, but it's high. The men is 98%. The women is high, 60, 70, let's say, okay?
But isn't the cost question, somehow you don't allow the productivities at home to change over time. So you have a wage process and you realize that market productivity across individuals or within individuals is changing over time. But there's an implicit assumption that home productivities are not changing over the lifetime.
So there's an implicit assumption that there isn't a stochastic component in the home productivities, but there are observables in there, with, age and the number of children in the household.
Right, but that's not allowing to influence Z1. Right? Z1 is not. None of that would be in Z1.
None of that would be in Z1. That's correct.
So what?
That's correct.
Let me rephrase the question. Is there always a process such that you will find a non-changing mu if you allow the right variation in home productivity?
Not sure I understand your question.
I mean, you're saying that there's limited commitment, but the issue is somehow you're imposing no change in home productivity at all. So what happens if home productivity was changing and there was full commitment?
Well, if home productivity was changing and there was full commitment, I would estimate this to be 1. Because this is off of the observed, the information that's going in there is only coming from the wage changes, right? And if they're irrelevant,
Is only coming from wage?
then it's not going to show up. So this is only picking up, I guess the other way to answer your question, this is only picking up the components of our observables in Z1, right? Costas' comment is that there are, some of the Z1s are censored, not all of them, but some of them are censored, and we probably should think a little bit about how to uncensor that. Okay. I think it's 1 minute, 2 minutes. Okay, so that was the end. Let's see if there's something more that I wanted to say about that. Right. Okay. So this, I guess I already kind of said that, but really you'd have to have it pretty extreme to move between less than a half or 1.5. So if you started down here, you might think about moving around in this section, but we don't think of households as moving from ones where the woman has no power to all the power, kind of an idea. Okay, so it's not like the lack of ability to commit means that there's going to be zero insurance in the household. There's some, it's reduced. I don't have these calculations in the slide. They're kind of giving up in terms of the consumption insurance about a rough number would be about half of the consumption insurance they could gain if they could fully commit. Okay, and I'll end right there.
Well, in the last minute, you're assuming that all shock to wages are permanent. So you're in principle, you could decompose between transitory shocks, permanent shocks. Because one aspect is that you would expect them to insure themselves against transitory shocks, whereas permanent shock might have an impact on the use. In principle, you could test both.
That's true. In principle, we could do that. I agree.
Another short question. Where is love in the moment?
So love is in the model. Where's love? Love is in the. You could do all of this with caring preferences, and that's where the love is. And what that means is that it's going to mean that the weight that we're estimating that we're saying can be between 0 and 1, love is going to keep it away from 0 and 1. That's where love is. I can go through I have a slide with the math, but I think you already know that you must. So if they really, really loved each other, this would all have to collapse to 1. Okay, that's where the love is. But it doesn't go off to 0 here, so there's some love. Right. Okay.